If I haven't met you before, I'm James. Nice to meet you. I'm glad you're here today. And this is Leslie, who lots of you have met. There is a theme here this morning, actually. Phil, who read the Bible, and Leslie, who's been waving her arms around, have agreed to become church members, and church meeting have decided to have them as well. So we'll properly welcome them. Yeah, okay, you can clap them in. We'll properly welcome them into membership, possibly next week or maybe another week. We've got Leslie here because I wanted to talk to her about her ministry with the deaf. And she and I have spoken, and it was a really interesting conversation. I felt like you should have all been in it. So that's kind of what we're doing, really. And this is where we'd normally do a sermon on a Sunday morning, but instead we're going to have a conversation. We're going to talk about the Bible passage we've read a little bit as well. But don't kind of think, oh, it's not a normal sermon and switch off. In fact, if anything else, think this is something interesting and different. What might God say to me today? Okay? The question I had was, what might you hear? And Leslie said, don't use that word.
Not today.
What might you experience or feel? What might God say to you today? Just be open. Yeah? I booked you in to come and have this conversation today, but actually there's lots of reasons why this is a good time to do it. Can you tell us why we're talking about this today?
It's actually Deaf Awareness Week. Did anybody know that? Oh,
some of you are aware.
Chris, wonderful. It's Deaf Awareness Week, so this is a perfect time to talk about deafness.
And you mentioned as well, in wider culture, there's just other things going on, which again I hadn't really clocked.
Oh, it's the BSL Act. It hasn't actually been that much on the news. The only thing that was on the news really was the demonstration in Trafalgar Square. But the BSL Act, for anybody who's deaf or deafened, is a huge thing. BSL was made a language in 2003.
Just if any of us don't know, explain what BSL means.
British Sign Language.
British Sign Language.
Which is different from American Sign Language and Australian Sign Language and all the different sign languages.
Is American Sign Language similar but with more swear words?
How would I know?
Oh, yeah, okay, yeah.
So
that's a whole other thing. If the teenagers were here, we could get you... No, we won't do it.
Yeah.
Sorry, as you were.
It's a big deal because although it's been a language since 2003, it hasn't had many rights, like Welsh has some rights. So although it is the third most used language in the UK, there's actually 150,000 people who are deaf or deafened, and 70,000 people added on who only use BSL. So
that's their first language.
That's their first language. And very few people and very few churches, to our shame, have that sort of welcoming thing for a deaf person. So it's a big thing. And the whole of England, of course, has taken off now and wants to learn BSL because of Rose dancing, which is great. So now BSL has rights. It's had 3 readings through the House of Commons. It has royal assent. So now the deaf community are looking for really just to be included equally.
And why does this matter to us? You know, in this church, why should we make room for deaf people? I mean, aren't there churches that run services in BSL or, do you know, what difference is this going to make to us?
There are services that run completely in BSL. There are deaf churches, but actually the deaf people would like to be included. Although they feel they are a tribe, they have their own spirit, their own culture. What they want to be is included in church. Don't we all want to be included in church? And deafness is such a barrier. So what they want is to have access, equal access in church, not just to be the flower lady, but to be somebody who's part of church life, part of church community. And we have to start somewhere. So we're starting somewhere.
Can you tell me about how you started? How did you get into this ministry? Tell us some of your story.
I'm very old, so it was a very long time ago. I was worshipping in Guildford. We lived in Guildford for a while, and I went to Millmead. And being a Geordie, and having Guildford people who don't talk like me at all, I used to go early to get a seat because it was a busy church. And I used to always sit at the back, right at the back where you are, hiding up there. That's where I used to sit, so people wouldn't necessarily come and speak to me, so I wouldn't be too anxious about the accent. And when I was there, I noticed that I was there for years, but there was some people in the very front row at the bottom signing. And I thought, gosh, isn't it awful if you're deaf and you don't get the chance to say yes or no to God? To say, yes, I want to come to church, I know I don't want to come to church, but not to have that choice. And I was very convicted. And the sermon was by Roger Foster, and he did a whole thing on let your yes be yes and your no be no. And I thought, gosh, that's important now for everybody. So I did a deaf awareness course, and then after a while I did level 1. And after 5 years, because there wasn't many courses then and it's a bit expensive, I did level 2, and after a few more years, I did level 3, and that's where I am, level 3. So I'm not an interpreter, I don't pretend to be one. What I would like to be known as is someone who actually shows God's love. And I think sign language sometimes just colours that. So where we have black and white songs and we have things in black and white, I think sign language sometimes just brings a bit of colour, a bit of deeper understanding sometimes. Like I said at the beginning, when deaf people would never take the Lord's name in vain. We hear people say Jesus Christ all the time, but deaf people wouldn't do that. Because on your hands, it's a little bit more real, isn't it? When you're saying Jesus Christ. So as a church, I would love to think we're going to do something special.
You said to me something about, did you say we get lost in our thinking or we get lost in our heads?
I think we get lost behind a mask. And lots of people put different faces on to come out. And certainly the English have very much stiff upper lip. And raising hands is difficult in lots of churches. Lots of people feel very shy. In sign language, it is very noticeable and very loud because the joy of the Lord has to come out. It can't be held tight and it can't be hidden. So deaf Christians absolutely give it all. And sign language gives it all. Because in English or in any spoken language, you have a raising and a lowering of your voice. So people would know if you were angry and they would know if you were sad. But in sign language, that has to be shown in the whole body, the whole of you. The whole of you is the language. And I find it quite releasing. I mean, you can probably tell in worship, I find that quite releasing. Sometimes I can feel God so close because I'm in that space. And deaf people who worship are in that space. I remember a long time ago, I was at a conference in Scarborough, and there was a deaf preacher called Bob McFarlane, an older man, and there was a younger deaf man in prison in India because he had a wooden leg, and the authorities thought he had drugs in his wooden leg. He didn't. He was a Christian. He was married to a Christian Indian woman. He didn't have drugs in his leg. But like all these prisoners that are taken for unusual reasons, he was kept for about 2 years in prison. And so we all knew about it. All the deaf community knew about it, and some hearing people knew about it. But on this conference, Bob McFarlane got up and he prayed for this man. And he prayed with every ounce of his body. He prayed so he was almost sweating. He was asking the Lord with every fibre of his being. And I remember thinking at that conference how cheap my words were and how flimsy my prayers were and how, as a matter of fact, I took things, easily. And I thought, I'm going to change. I'm going to make sure God has every part of me. And so it makes a difference.
We maybe came in here this morning and we were thinking we're going to talk about deafness. We're going to talk about Deaf Awareness Week. And probably the first thought lots of us had was the lack. Being deaf is a lack. But actually, right now, you're talking about almost deafness as a gift. You're not really saying that, but certainly in your experience, receiving from deaf people what you might not have received from others. Can you say some more about kind of how being involved in this ministry has has blessed you, what you've gained, perhaps some of the people you've met, if you want to?
Well, no offence to anybody here, but deaf preachers have probably given me my best learning. Because obviously, when you go to a conference or you're with a deaf preacher, you do have a voiceover, so don't worry, somebody is voicing over. But you're also getting that in sign language, you get that in 3D. And some of the words and some of the Bible verses that have been given to me in sign language have blessed me more. I've brought this along to read. I thought it might be a good thing. Because, you know, when a deaf baby's born, after the baby is discovered to be deaf, profoundly deaf, doesn't the doctor always say, "I'm so sorry your baby's deaf"? So, you know, deaf babies are already starting out on a negative because the doctor's saying, "I'm so sorry your baby's deaf." Deaf people don't always see it that way. This is a quote from a play called Children of the Lesser God. It's written by a deaf lady. "For all my life, I have been the creation of other people. The first thing I was able to understand was that everyone was supposed to hear, and I couldn't, so that was bad. To be smart, I had to become an imitation of the people who had from birth everything a person has to have to be good. Ears that hear, a mouth that speaks, eyes that read, a brain that understands. Well, my brain understands a lot, and my eyes are my ears, and my hands are my voice, and my language, my speech, and my ability to communicate is as great as yours, greater maybe, because I can communicate to you in one sign, in one image, an idea much more complex than you can never speak to each other." And that's how I feel about it, really. That things I've been given from, I'll say, my deaf community, the deaf community all over England, you know, I've been around England, are precious. They are precious moments. And the moments sometimes hearing people miss. We miss them because they're not there. We don't get involved. We're embarrassed. A lot of hearing people are embarrassed when they see somebody in the street signing and it's very large. It's embarrassing. My own husband gets embarrassed. I used to live in Bridport and I ran a day centre there and I had a few deaf clients. And he was embarrassed because he didn't know quite how to take any of that. That would be all of us, wouldn't it? At first we'd be embarrassed. But there's nothing to be frightened of because I find deaf people absolutely some of the best friends I have. One lady who I've asked her if I could mention her this morning, her name is June Lush, and I met, just Lush, I met her at the conference, and she was lovely to me. I was a new signer, I was very nervous, and I have an identical twin who signs a lot better than I do, and when I first went to the conference, I got there before Isabel, because she lives in Newcastle and I lived in the south. And they all came rushing over and everybody was signing at me as if I knew what they were saying. And I was absolutely overwhelmed. And I was saying, I'm the wrong one. You look at my sister, I'm not my sister. But June Lush came over and she knew I wasn't Isabel. And she was so kind to me. And we went to her bedroom every night and we learned worship songs with her. And when I spoke about the heart for the deaf that I have, she said, "Oh, I have a heart for the hearing." You don't think that, do you?
Yes, brilliant.
And I was upset because I was so full of my own importance doing the signing and learning the signing that I hadn't thought that June would have a heart for the hearing, to be more involved and to see deeper and to see differently and to feel more. So am I going on? That's
No, you're doing well. You also talked, by the way, does anybody think she needs to be anxious about this lovely accent? No, good. You talked about how some words, particularly theological words, have come to life for you since you learned how they're signed.
Yeah.
Have you got any on the top of your head that you could show us?
Well, I did one during that song, and the sign forgive is forgive. It's a bit like wiping the slate clean. Forgive.
Yeah, great.
Forgive. And say the sign for redeemed is paid on the nail. Paid on the nail. That gets to you, doesn't it? Paid on the nail. And the sign for sorry is rub your heart. Sorry. That kind of thing. Yeah.
It's good. Jesus healed deaf people. More than once, I think. What do the deaf community think about that?
It's a question I'm asked a lot, actually. And of course, the rebellious part of me says, well, why don't you ask a deaf person that? Because everybody's individual for their healing and their healing needs. And I don't mean that nasty at all, but a deaf person would tell you that. And deaf people have different views, just like we all have different views on everything. So today...
And just to be clear, you're not saying, because we sometimes have a discussion about does Jesus still heal today. You're not saying that. This is about whether deafness is something that needs to be healed or not.
Yeah, exactly that. Sorry. Of course, Jesus heals. It's whether deaf people look at their disability, if you call it a disability, as a thing that needs to be healed. I was telling James this morning about a young man who was in church, a deaf young man with his deaf fiancée, in a church, visiting a church, and the pastor came up and said, we'll pray for you. And he thought, great. And they prayed for him to be healed of his deafness, when he thought they were coming to pray for him and his fiancée getting married, because that was the thing in his life. And healing for his deafness, he didn't see as that something that he wanted or that he needed. He was part of the deaf culture, part of the deaf community. So part of me thinks, do we say sometimes that deaf people should be healed because that's what we want? The hearing world would like deaf people to be healed. I'm not sure if all the deaf community would see that as a thing that they need most of all. They would be praying for Ukraine this morning, not to be healed. They'd be praying for their sick relatives this morning, not necessarily to be healed. Of course, there's a big thing at the moment about cochlear implants, and a lot of deaf people have chosen to have cochlear implants. I've got to say, it's divided the deaf community. Some people feel that people with cochlear implants have, come away from their own culture, from their own tribe. Other people think, they're just being part of a bigger scene, a bigger world, just like us learning sign language. It's a difficult topic, and I haven't got any clear answers.
You said something to me when we were chatting, I think it was in the context of hearing parents of a deaf child.
Yeah.
It was an example, and you finished by saying there's a lot of you in that. Do you remember what we said? Can you remember that?
It was because there's 840 children, deaf children born a year. It's quite a lot, isn't it? So out of those 840 children, 9 out of 10 were born to hearing parents. And 1 out of 10 hearing parents learn sign language. Wow. So sometimes we wonder what we are doing as a caring community, whether they be our children or not, to invite people in. So when James is saying that there's a lot of you about it, sometimes if that mother's fighting for that child to get a cochlear implant or, have tests, or I'm sorry, your child's deaf, to look at that differently, it's probably because there's a lot of us in that. We can't cope with it, so we want it different. So how much of you is in that need?
Coming back to Jesus and healing again, we tend to read about the miracles in the gospel accounts, and we think, maybe first of all we think this is Jesus showing his divine power, or we might think this is a sign of new creation breaking in, or something like that. I have a friend who one time looked at all of those miracles and decided that behind them all was Jesus wanting to see community restored, people included. So, if you had leprosy or some other thing, when you were healed, it wasn't just that your body was made whole. Maybe that wasn't even the primary thing. It was that your relationships were restored with your family in your neighborhood, or you could begin your career again, or whatever else. Or the widow with the son. Do you remember that story? And it's his funeral, and Jesus raises him so that he can help provide for her again. It's about these relationships within community. So that I wonder, well, first of all, rather than us thinking perhaps deafness as a lack, maybe we need to think about the sickness of society if deaf people cannot be involved and engaged in society, and the same within church, the sickness of church. Our need for Jesus to step in and restore relationship will help us to be inclusive, which might be more important than repairing us or fixing a lack, or however we think about that. I was also thinking about the psalm we had, I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever, and Jesus talked in this reading about eternal life as well. We imagine how it will be when we're with Jesus face to face, when we're in heaven, or when the new creation comes, however you think of those things. And we might think, oh, that's when I'll have a perfect body. But of course, the idea of us having a perfect body is much more about our culture than necessarily what the Bible says. What we do look forward to in heaven, or in the restoration of all things, is perfect relationship, isn't it? It seems that Jesus is most concerned about our relationship with God through him and our relationship with each other. In the reading, it also said, Jesus said, the Father and I are one. So again, that relationship between the Father and Jesus being shared amongst us in society, us in Christian community. Jesus said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Love your neighbour as you love yourself. That's all about relationship, isn't it? I wonder if that's a helpful way to think about.
It is, and I think when we read in the Bible about a still small voice, most of us would think that wasn't audible anyway. This would be where the still small voice is. Are you agreeing? That would be, you don't think you're going to, do I think I'm going to hear God's voice audibly? Probably not. But I certainly know when God is speaking to me. And that is available for everybody. That still small voice here would be felt, so it's more of a feeling. So often when I sign songs with the word hear in, I hear your word, I would sign I feel your word, because that's how it is for a deaf person.
So in the gospel reading we had, do you remember Jesus said, my sheep hear my voice, didn't he?
Yeah.
But you're right, when we use the word hear, actually it means all sorts of things, doesn't it? It doesn't just mean hearing something audibly, does it? When you hear someone, when I hear my wife, it means I've understood, doesn't it? It's not the same thing as an audible thing necessarily.
It's actually one of the signs that I use as well, because some songs are repeated, would be I hear or I hear. It's almost like the pennies dropped. I hear, I realise.
Yeah, great. So the reading was, Jesus said, my sheep, okay, this is interesting. I've got my sheep listen to my voice anyway, actually, which is a bit broader than just hearing, isn't it, potentially? My sheep listen to my voice. I know them, and they will follow me. I give them eternal life, and they shall never perish. No one will snatch them out of my hand. And so their hearing is not, or listening to, is not really about the auditory thing. It's about being given what you need to follow, isn't it? Jesus wants us to obey him, and that's why he speaks. That's why he says, my sheep know me and know how I'm leading them. Sorry, that wasn't really a question, but do you want to say anything?
No, that's exactly right.
That's exactly right. The church hasn't always done well with this, has it? I didn't know all of this, but tell me. Historically,
in the 18th century, it goes, sign language goes back for many, many years to the 16th century. But in the 18th century, I'm sure you've heard of Alexander Graham Bell. Yeah, he banned sign language. He made the telephone. He invented metal detectors. He had a deaf wife. But in a conference in Milan in about 1860 or something, him and the other educators of the time thought that deaf people were dumb. They would never amount to anything. They wouldn't be worth putting effort into unless they could speak. So the deaf people in those days were forced down the oral route. So there wasn't a choice for them. Today there's a choice. They were forced down that oral route. So they weren't allowed to marry in church because they wouldn't understand. They weren't allowed to have children because they might be born deaf. They weren't allowed to have communion because what would they know about it? So you can imagine being a Christian woman, wanting to bring deaf people into our community, wanting to bring deaf people to God. It's a bit of an uphill climb, because for some of these people that I know, it's within their generations behind that deaf people have been treated so badly. In fact, when I do my courses, some of the signs are quite funny. So because in those days, deaf people were either made to work at Tate and Lyle, the sugar factory, or they were made to go on boats and become crewmen on boats. And the sign for sugar is sugar, because the people in Tate and Lyle used to get skin disease, eczema, with all the sugar. And the students have got laugh at biscuit, because this is what I've been told, but I have been told by deaf people, so it must be true, that the sign for biscuit is biscuit, because they used to knock the weevils out of the biscuits on board ship by doing that before they ate them. I don't know, that's what I was told. So historically, the church and the giving of church and God to deaf people hasn't been great. So we're working on it now. In 2003, which was a while ago now, nearly 20 years, there was a document produced called the Sign Me In document, which was given to loads and loads of churches. And a big team from Signs of God, it's a Christian group, will go around all the churches with this big document about how you can do it. This is how you can do it, folks. This is how you can get on board. Let everybody get signed in. And there wasn't a great take-up. It's a little bit sad, isn't it, that it takes somebody to do a bit of dancing to bring us all right up front with this deaf awareness. But we're all moving on, so we're hoping for better things.
We also, when we were chatting, we thought about this passage in Romans 10, I'll read it. Everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. How then can they call on the one they have not believed in? And how can they believe in the one of whom they have not heard? And how can they hear without someone preaching to them? And how can anyone preach unless they are sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who bring the good news. And there were several things in there for me. One was, how can they believe in the one of whom they have not heard? You mentioned about the church not allowing deaf people to take communion, because how would they have understood? It sounds at first as if this is the same, isn't it? How can you believe in Jesus if you've not heard about Jesus? But then immediately it feels like the passage turns on us, doesn't it? Well, hang on a minute, it's up to the church. It's the church who has the responsibility in making sure deaf people hear, receive, learn, obey the gospel message, isn't it?
And about the beautiful feet, it is a beautiful language. It's a pictorial language, so people who have trouble with language can learn visually, because it's a visual language. It's a beautiful thing to know.
I hadn't spotted that until I've just read it now. I didn't think of it earlier, but you're right. The ones who go out to preach the message so that those can hear it and receive it. And that's what really matters, isn't it? We've got to communicate in a way that the people out there can hear and receive and make sense of, whoever they are, including deaf people. But then it goes on to say, how beautiful are the feet? Not how beautiful are the words. It's really interesting, isn't it? You don't sign with your feet, do you?
Not yet.
Not yet, okay. Why don't you tell us how we can get involved? So some of us listening to this morning will be thinking, oh my goodness, this sounds fantastic. I'd love to do this. What are we going to do in the next few weeks and months?
Well, I'm quite excited, and I was wondering if we could do some work in church to help people become more confident and welcoming and able to do just a few things. So I'm running a few courses. I've got to say, if you're doing sign language as a proper thing, say you're going to do your levels and go on properly, you should be taught by a deaf person. This is not my language. I'm facilitating and helping people get more confident about going on a course and learning, if you like, properly from a native speaker, as it were. But I think it's really helpful if you have a taster first. So I'm hoping to do signing for 6 weeks, perhaps an hour and a half, because that's probably all you can take, an hour and a half, and it gets a bit spongy. An hour and a half of time for 6 weeks, certainly for the people who welcome folk into church and for anybody else who's interested, just to be able to say, hello, how are you? What your name is. Ask them what their name is. Ask them about their family. Are the family well? Do you have children? All the stuff we'd normally say to anybody who walks through the door. There will be a list, and anybody interested, can I just see a show of hands? Oh, that's brilliant.
I'm mostly interested, but I think you told me I had to do it.
Let's do it.
So that's why I've got my hand
He
up.
has to do it. That's a class already thing, so that's great. And some folk in the congregation have already been to some of my courses, and it really is an enlightening place to be, would you say, Chris? Yeah. It's happy, it's fun, and it's a new language. And this language could well be a GCSE shortly.
Yeah, right.
So you could be having your children or your grandchildren learn another language.
Yeah, and if any of us don't have any GCSEs because we didn't enjoy school very much, this could be the
perhaps
beginning of our
This could
academic
be
career.
the one. Yeah. I'm also hoping to do some things with the children. Children are like sponges, as you know. So probably nearer Christmas, once I've got you adults kind of on board, we'll be teaching the children probably some carols in sign language, so they get a different meaning of Christmas.
And I've invited you to sign some more of our services here.
Yeah.
And you've said you'd be happy to do one a month at the moment.
What I thought, if it's okay with everybody, is to probably sign the worship every week. Because I've been practicing in the back row, but it's very hard for me to stay at the back row when I'm so full of that joy. I want to give you that joy. And thank you for sharing that with me this morning. Thank you for signing along. It's a great encouragement. So I thought, we'll just get used to the signer at the front, because the worst thing a signer can be is the entertainment on a Sunday morning. So I would like you to get used to me. So if a deaf person comes, it isn't such a, surprising thing. And then so I can keep my practice going, I would like to do this whole service once a month. That's the prayers and everything. And I get prepped, so don't worry. I do get prepped beforehand. I do look and pray about what we're doing.
Yeah, and you put a lot of time into it. You told me about a day to prepare for Sunday service.
It took about 6 hours for Easter. Because you've got to get it right, You can't bluff it. I know I could probably bluff it right now, except for you. I could probably bluff what I was doing. You wouldn't know what on earth I was signing. But morally, I feel I have to get it right. So I do a lot of prep. And everybody who's signing anywhere on stage would do a lot of prep. So I like to have that. So I thought if I did the whole service once a month, but of course, any time a deaf person walks through the door, I'm up and at it. So once a month I keep my hand in, but any time, because there is some deaf people in Crediton, deaf people tend to travel anywhere for a deaf service. So there's a group in Tiverton, there's a group in Honiton, there's a group in Bridport. There's quite a few groups. So you never know, you might be getting someone through the door who's asking you your name in sign language. You better get on the course.
I think you set up the group in Bridport.
I did. I set up a deaf club in Bridport.
And you were there at a church. I'm saying this quickly because I realise we need to wrap up fairly soon, which is my fault. You were there at a church and you told me you signed for a year the services and before somebody deaf came. Because, of course, that's the way around it has to be.
Imagine how embarrassing that was, can't you? But, you've got to stick into your commitment. And I felt the Lord was saying, be there, do that. So I did. I stood at the front for a whole year. Started with the worship and then did the service. And I remember one time, just before we had deaf people then come, I had a music stand, and in the Telegraph there was a picture of a big spade. So I cut that spade out, and I put that spade on cardboard, and I stuck it on my music stand. I'm digging in here, Lord. I'm digging in and I'm waiting. And I was blessed because not long after that, we had a few people come, and they're still going to church, I'm hoping. But even if not, even if they're not going to church, they had the chance to say yes or no. They had a seed planted. I'm hoping that deaf hearing people were blessed. You never know. I'm hoping that you'll all be blessed, that this church will be blessed by what the Lord has given me the opportunity to do. Because 6 months ago, I was in a different church, not looking at anything, not looking, to use my signing. I hadn't used it for 3 or 4 years. Not looking, thinking I'm a bit old for this now. I'm going to be put on the shelf. And isn't the Lord surprising? Isn't that just amazing that we're never stopped being used? We're never finished. God's never finished with us. So it is a great joy. I hope you can see that joy. It's a great joy for me to be used again in a church where I feel welcome. Thank you very much.
You can give her a clap if you like. So what I wrote down in my notes is I'm then going to ask the congregation, what did you hear? But what you quite rightly want me to ask is, what did you feel? How did you feel, God? What was spoken to you today? Is there anything you want to say? And it might be directly related to what we've been talking about. Or it might be a tangential, is that right? Is that a word? Tangential thought. Is there anything that you want to say out loud now that you heard this morning, done it again, that you felt, that you knew from God this morning, which has encouraged you? For me, there's a lot of power in you saying, I can't remember what the last thing you said, I can't remember the words you used, the last thing you said, something like, God's not given up on us, God's still got more for us. I wondered if there's a few of us, it's good for us to hear that today, as a word from the Lord today.